both regions. And when you bring the Pacific's perspective, because that is the whole idea of what the Intra ACP Agricultural Policy Program is doing, is to make sure that we exchange the experiences from the Caribbean and the Pacific. And in the Pacific, they do have some really good interventions, but also some really good examples, success stories in the Pacific that the Caribbeans can also learn from it. And to continue on your point, on the climate smart agriculture and how it can contribute to the economy, the Pacific has done some tremendous experiments, and as you know, the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, which is one of our main partners in the Pacific that we work with, not only under Intra ACP but also under different programs that we have with them, because we have an MOU, CTA has an MOU with them. They've implemented some very, very interesting research in terms of having drought smart crops, where recently this year in May, a group from Cardi went to the Pacific under the project Intra ACP. They went to the Pacific actually to learn those techniques, because they're really interested in having these crops such as dasheen you have here, that the Pacific has really, really developed a very good drought smart crops in dasheen, and that they're very interested in having them in the Caribbean as well, that they will adapt very well here in the Caribbean. So these exchanges are really important, because in some areas where the Pacific has made progress in terms of these new technology and also new crops that are coming up, such as drought smart crops, the Caribbean can learn from them, and vice versa. Because the Caribbean, for the Pacific, for example, is interested in having the yellow yam from the Caribbean and how they can change that. So again, it's all this exchange actually that will help in contributing to a sustainable way, but also contributing to food security in both regions. Because once again, we both face similar challenges. So again, when you're having those smart crops, it not only contribute to the fact that it alleviates poverty and food nutrition security and other issues related to food and nutrition, but it also relates into, for example, going into an economy of scale, where you plant new produce, make sure that your economy is again sustained, and you can export a new variety of dasheen. And in the Pacific we call taro, we say taro, but here in the Caribbean you say dasheen. So this is one clear example of how you can contribute to the economy with these climate smart tools. But also, I'd like to bring in a very big perspective of the Pacific in general, on how we can exchange experience, but also how the Pacific can contribute there as well. Because as Juan mentioned, we are here today for Caribbean-Pacific Agri-Food Forum. What can we do in the Pacific region, and what can the Caribbean learn as well from the Pacific region that can contribute somehow to their economy here? So, as Juan mentioned, we've started last year a conference in Grenada, and then we took it over to the Pacific this year, earlier in July, for the Pacific Community Agritourism Week. We take it there actually, and where we invited the Caribbean to come and share their experiences. For example, in the agritourism, as we know, both regions have huge demand in terms of tourism. The Caribbean may receive more than the Pacific, but the Pacific is very small, and as you know, in terms of receiving number of tourists, but also because the Pacific is really vast. So again, it would be good for the Caribbean to understand the players in the Pacific and how big the Pacific is. Sometimes we look at the islands, we think they're very close, but no, they're not at all. So the fact that the Caribbean comes to the Pacific and see the challenges we face, for example, in terms of transport, when we're talking about value chain, transport is a big issue in the Pacific for that reason. Yeah, so you have, for example, some islands that are overproducing tomato, for example, but they cannot get it to the next island because the transport is not there. So transport, I think, is a very big key issue that in terms of value chain, it's a big component of that. Because if you cannot transport that to the market, it's really difficult, and you always have to have imported from your normal route, for example, in the Pacific, Australia to these islands, and it brings up the price, and it makes it more difficult for local people to be able to have access to those food. So in the agribusiness sector, the Pacific is coming up slowly, and we have, as I said previously, some very good success stories that we hope that this conference actually will also have in the coming years to make sure that we bring these experiences to the Pacific, and we see how the Pacific can contribute towards a sharing experience between both regions and alleviate all our issues we have in both regions, not all, but some of them related to food and nutrition security. So once again, we're looking at developing different specific value chains, but also looking at what is at stake for both regions, because we might be having similar challenges, but sometimes on the ground itself, Pacific may be different in some areas. So we also need to adapt that to the local context. and looking at what is happening on the ground, and bring it up and make sure that that this experience again is shared. We've heard yesterday, if you participated in building successful agribusiness, we've heard some very interesting stories from the Pacific that the Caribbeans are really, really eager to learn. And we also hear a lot of interesting stories from the Caribbean that the Pacific are really eager to learn as well. And this is what we promote actually under, what CTA promotes under its Intra ACP component, the Intra ACP Agriculture Policy Program. So that's what I just want to